The territory was a vast, open wound in the earth, stretching out under a sky so wide and blindingly blue that it felt as if it could swallow a person whole and leave no trace behind. It was a landscape of endless brown plains that rolled like a dry ocean, broken only by the jutting, blood-colored ribs of red rock buttes that pierced the horizon. The wind here was never still. It carried the taste of grit and ancient dust, spinning into tall, erratic devils that danced across the wagon road, scouring everything they touched. To ride through this country was to pass through a graveyard of ambition. Along the trail leading toward the cattle town of Red Butte, the sun-bleached rib cages of oxen lay half buried in the sand, white as porcelain against the red dirt. Further on, the charred, skeletal remains of a wagon sat abandoned, its iron wheel rims rusting into the scrub brush, a silent testament to those who had tried to cross this unforgiving expanse and failed. There was no mercy here, only the hard, indifferent law of survival. Into this desolation walked Clara. She did not arrive on a stagecoach or atop a fine horse, but on foot, trailing the dusty wake of a freight wagon that had allowed her to ride in the back for the last 20 miles. She stepped onto the main street of Red Butte with a small, carpet bag gripped in her hand. The floral pattern of the fabric faded to a dull gray by the journey. Her boots were worn through at the soles, and the hem of her calico dress was heavy with the red dust of the road. Clara kept her head down. The brim of her bonnet pulled low to shadow her face, but it could not hide everything. There were bruises fading along her forearms, ugly mottling of yellow and green that spoke of a grip too tight, a shove too hard. A darker shadow lingered beneath her left eye, easily mistaken for fatigue, though she knew the truth of it. She walked with a stiff, guarded gait, the walk of a woman who expects the next blow to come from any direction. The town of Red Butte was little more than a collection of rough-hewn timber buildings huddled against the wind. But it had eyes. On the porch of the general store, 2 old men sat on a bench, whittling cedar sticks and chewing tobacco. They stopped their quiet talk as she passed, their eyes narrowing, tracking her progress with the suspicion reserved for strangers who arrived with nothing. A woman swept the boardwalk in front of the millinery shop, the storekeeper's wife, a stern creature with a mouth set in a hard line. She paused, leaning on her broom, and watched Clara trudge past. Clara felt the weight of that gaze, heavy as a stone. She heard the whisper that followed, sharp enough to cut through the wind. "She looks like trouble," the woman murmured to no one in particular, though the words carried, "No better than a saloon girl, walking in like that. Look at those hollow eyes. She has seen the inside of a bottle or a gambling hall. I would wager my Sunday hat on it." Clara tightened her grip on the carpet bag until her knuckles turned white. She did not look up. She did not defend herself. In a place like this, a woman without a husband or a family was already guilty of something. She found the only shelter she could afford, a cramped room tacked onto the back of the laundry house, down a narrow alley that smelled of lye soap and damp wood. The landlady, a widow with hands like gnarled roots, took Clara's last $3 for a week's rent without asking for a name. The room was a box, stiflingly hot in the day and bitter cold at night. The walls were thin planks that let in the wind and the noise of the town, and the roof showed daylight through the shingles. It was a wretched place, but it had a door with a heavy iron bolt. That was all Clara cared about. As soon as she was inside, she slid the bolt home, her breath hitching in her chest as she finally allowed her shoulders to slump. She was safe, for the moment. She was alone. Her routine became a brutal cycle of labor and exhaustion, designed to keep her mind from drifting back to the life she had fled. By day, she worked at the laundry. The water from the river was brown and cold, hauled up in buckets that strained the muscles of her back. She spent 12 hours a day bent over the scrubbing boards, her hands submerged in the harsh lye water until the skin wrinkled and peeled. Within a week, her fingers were cracked and bleeding, the raw flesh stinging with every plunge into the soapy tub. She scrubbed the trail dust from cowboys' shirts and the grease from miners' trousers, working until her arms felt like lead weights. She spoke to no one. when the other laundresses chattered about town gossip or their children. Clara scrubbed harder, the rhythmic rasp of fabric against metal filling the silence. She ate her lunch, usually a piece of stale bread and an apple, sitting on an overturned crate in the alley, staring at the ground. At night, survival demanded more. The coin she earned at the laundry was barely enough to keep the roof over her head. So she took work at the Drover's Rest, the largest saloon in Red Butte. She was not a girl who danced with the men or poured their whiskey. She had made that clear to the owner, a sweating, anxious man named Mr. Sullivan. She would sing, and that was all. She stood on the small wooden stage in the corner, her dress high-collared and plain, keeping her gaze fixed on the back wall, well above the heads of the men who drank and gambled at the tables. Her voice was not powerful, but it was true and clear, a haunting soprano that could cut through the din of clinking glasses and raucous laughter. She sang old ballads, songs of lost loves and green valleys that none of them would ever see again. She learned to make herself small, even when standing in the light. When she stepped down from the stage, she moved like a ghost, skirting the edges of the room. She flinched when a drunk patron brushed past her, her body going rigid, her eyes wide and feral for a heartbeat before she mastered herself. She always stood with her back against a wall, ensuring no one could come up behind her. The touch of a stranger, even an accidental graze of a sleeve, sent a jolt of cold terror through her veins that made her stomach turn. Sleep was the only time her guard fell, and it was then that the past came for her. In the narrow cot in her back room, she would toss and turn, the thin blanket tangled around her legs. The nightmares were always the same. She was back in a gambling hall, the air thick with smoke. There was the sound of breaking glass, sharp and violent. Then came the voice, shouting, a man's voice that started low and rose to a scream that tore at her sanity. She would see a hand raised, a heavy gold ring flashing in the lamplight, and then the sensation of falling. She would wake gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, sweat cooling on her skin. In the dark, trembling, she would reach for the small locket she kept hidden inside her pillowcase. It was cheap silver, tarnished and dented, but inside lay a single lock of fine, pale hair. She would press the metal against her lips, squeezing her eyes shut, rocking back and forth until the panic receded enough for her to stand. Then she would wash her face in the basin, put on her dress, and go back to the scrubbing board. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury for women who had someone to dry them. It was 3 weeks after Clara arrived that Eli rode into Red Butte. He came from the north, a solitary figure emerging from the heat haze of the plains. He rode a tall, dust-colored gelding that looked as tired as the man in the saddle. The horse had a jagged white scar on its flank, an old injury that had healed badly but strong. The man rode with an easy, loose-limbed grace, his body moving in rhythm with the animal, but his head was constantly turning, scanning the horizon, the rooftops, the shadows between buildings. Eli was a man whom the land had carved down to the bone. He was not handsome in the way the town dandies were, with their oiled mustaches and checked suits. His face was lean and sun-darkened to the color of saddle leather, covered in a week's growth of dark beard. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his collar, a souvenir of a knife fight in a border town years ago. His hat was pulled low, the brim stained with sweat and rain. But it was his hands that told his story. They were large, rough hands, the knuckles scarred and swollen from years of breaking horses, mending fences, and fighting men. The palms were thick with calluses, hard as wood. They were the hands of a man who worked, and the hands of a man who could kill. He wore a revolver on his hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth, the grip of the gun devoid of any decoration. It was a tool, nothing more. He reined in his horse at the livery stable, dismounting with a groan of stiff joints. He patted the gelding's neck, his touch surprisingly gentle for such rough hands, murmuring low words to the beast. "Easy now, boy," Eli said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "We are done for the day." He led the horse inside and found the owner, A squint-eyed man named Silas. Eli needed money, and he needed it without questions. "I'm looking for work," Eli said. "I can shoe horses, mend tack, or shovel out the stalls. I am not particular." Silas looked him over, taking in the dust, the gun, and the quiet, dangerous stillness that hung around Eli like a cloak. Men like this usually brought trouble, but they also worked harder than anyone else. $2 a day. Silas grunted. "You can sleep in the loft, but you keep that iron on your hip holstered while you are under my roof." "I have no quarrel with anyone here," Eli said simply. He set to work immediately. He stripped off his coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms roped with muscle and marked by the white lines of old barbed wire scratches. He shoveled manure for 4 hours straight, never stopping to rest, working with a grim, mechanical efficiency. The men of Red Butte noticed him quickly. You could not miss a man who moved like a wolf among sheepdogs. When he went to the general store for tobacco, conversation died down. They recognized the walk of a hired gun, or at least a man who had seen enough violence to be wary of his own shadow. They asked him where he was from, and he gave them names of towns that were days of hard riding away. "Just drifting through," the blacksmith asked him one afternoon. "Looking for quiet," Eli replied, not meeting the man's eyes. Quiet was something Eli craved but could never quite find. At night, lying in the hay of the stable loft, staring up at the dark rafters, the silence was his enemy. In the quiet, the memories came. He replayed a single moment, over and over. A dusty street in Abilene, the sun high and hot, a young man, barely 20, shouting insults, hand hovering over his gun. Eli had tried to walk away. He had tried to talk him down, but the boy had drawn. Eli remembered the weight of his own Colt, the recoil that traveled up his arm, the puff of smoke. He remembered the look of surprise on the boy's face as he crumpled into the dirt, a red stain spreading across his chest. It had been a fair fight. Everyone said so, but the boy never got up, and Eli had to keep living. That was the curse of being faster. You survived to carry the ghosts. One Thursday evening, the heat in Red Butte was oppressive. The air hung thick and motionless, smelling of ozone and dried mud. The drover's rest was packed to the rafters. A cattle crew from the Circle T Ranch had just been paid, and they were intent on drinking their wages before sunrise. The saloon was a chaotic swirl of noise, shouting men, the tinny clatter of the piano, the clink of bottles, and the heavy haze of cigar smoke that burned the eyes. Eli stood near the back of the room, nursing a single glass of whiskey he had made last for an hour. He wore his hat low, his back pressed into the corner, watching the room with hooded eyes. He did not like crowds. He did not like the smell of desperate men looking for a fight. But the loft was stiflingly hot, and he needed the noise to drown out his own thoughts. On the small stage, Clara was singing. She looked exhausted. Her face was pale, glistening with a sheen of perspiration in the breathless room. She sang a ballad about a soldier dying in a field of rye, her voice soft but steady, threading through the roar of the cattle crew like a silver wire. Eli watched her. He had seen her walking to the laundry earlier that week, head down, shoulders hunched. He recognized that posture. It was the stance of a kicked dog trying to make itself invisible. He watched the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the fabric of her skirt. She looked fragile, like a piece of china that had already been glued back together once and would shatter if dropped again. The song ended, and there was a smattering of applause, mostly drowned out by a loud argument at the poker table. Clara gave a small, jerky nod and moved to step off the stage, intending to retreat to the safety of the back hallway, but the mood in the room had shifted. The whiskey had done its work, turning boisterous energy into something darker and more predatory. A cowboy near the front, a burly man with a red face and a mustache stained with tobacco juice, lunged out as she passed. He caught her by the wrist, his grip jarring her to a halt. "Do not run off so fast." "Sweetheart," the cowboy slurred, yanking her toward his table. "You have got a pretty voice. Come sit on my lap and sing something sweeter." Clara's eyes went wide, panic cold and absolute, slammed into her. "Let go of me," she gasped, trying to twist her arm free. "Oh, she is a feisty one." The cowboy laughed, tightening his grip until Clara cried out in pain. "I like them feisty. Come here." He pulled hard, dragging her off balance. Clara stumbled, her other hand flailing, knocking a half-empty beer glass off the table. It shattered on the floor. Another man from the crew stood up, blocking her path to the door. He moved in close, pressing Clara back against the edge of the bar. "You heard him," the second man sneered, his hand creeping up toward her throat, his fingers thick and clumsy. "Be nice, girl. You are just a saloon singer. Do not act like you are too good for a little fun." "Please," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. Her heart was beating so fast she thought she might faint. She looked toward the bar, pleading with her eyes for Mr. Sullivan to help. The saloon owner stood behind the counter, wiping a glass. He looked at the cattle crew, 10 armed men, drunk and spending money. And then he looked at Clara. He looked down and kept wiping the glass. The man holding her wrist laughed again and yanked her closer, his breath hot and sour on her face. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, her body rigid with the memory of other hands, other cruelties. Then the air shifted. A shadow fell over the table. A hand, rough and scarred, shot out and clamped onto the cowboy's wrist, the one holding Clara. It was not a violent grab, but it was immovable, like a vise of iron. "Let her go," a voice said. It was not a shout. It was a low, flat command that cut through the noise at the table like a knife blade. The cowboy looked up, blinking, to find Eli standing over him. Eli's face was unreadable, but his eyes were hard, dark flint. "Who are you?" the cowboy spat, trying to shake Eli off. "This is none of your business." "Saddle tramp," I said. "Let her go," Eli repeated. He increased the pressure on the cowboy's wrist, a slow, crushing grind. The cowboy yelled in surprise and pain, his fingers springing open. Clara scrambled back, gasping, clutching her bruised wrist to her chest. She pressed herself against the wall, shaking violently. The cowboy shoved his chair back and stood up, stumbling slightly. He was big, heavier than Eli, and fueled by liquid courage. "You want to dance?" the cowboy roared. "I will break your jaw." He swung a wild, looping punch at Eli's head. Eli did not panic. He did not even seem to hurry. He simply stepped inside the swing, his movement precise and controlled. He blocked the arm with his left forearm and drove his right fist into the cowboy's solar plexus. It was a short, brutal blow, powered by the turn of his hips. The cowboy doubled over, all the air rushing out of him in a wheeze, before the man could fall. Eli grabbed him by the collar and the belt and drove him backward, slamming him into the table. Wood splintered, bottles crashed to the floor, and the cowboy went down in a heap of groans and spilled beer. The second man, the one who had cornered Clara, reached for the knife at his belt. Eli spun, his hand flashing out. He backhanded the man across the face, a heavy, stinging blow that sent him staggering into the bar rail. "Stay down," Eli warned. His voice dropped to a menacing growl. The rest of the cattle crew surged to their feet, hands going to guns and bottles. The piano player scrambled backward, knocking over his bench. The room teetered on the edge of a bloodbath. "That is enough!" The shout came from the doorway. Sheriff Miller stormed in, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at the room. He was a thick-set man with a flushed face and a badge that gleamed dully on his vest. Behind him stood 2 deputies. "Break it up," the sheriff bellowed. "Anyone touches a gun, they spend the month in the county jail." The tension held for a long, agonizing second before slowly breaking. The cattle crew, seeing the shotgun, raised their hands and backed away. The man on the floor groaned and rolled over, clutching his stomach. Eli stood in the center of the wreckage, his breathing even. His hands relaxed at his sides, though the knuckles of his right hand were skinned and bleeding. Sheriff Miller lowered the shotgun and marched over, glaring not at the drunken men who had started the assault, but at Eli. "I might have known," Miller spat. "Drifting trouble. I saw you ride in." "They were hurting her," Eli said, nodding toward where Clara stood trembling against the wall. "She is a saloon girl," Miller sneered, looking at Clara with open contempt. "It comes with the territory. You do not tear up a place of business over a woman who invites it." Clara felt the words like a slap. She heard a man at a nearby table mutter, "He is right. Look at that dress. She knows what she is selling." Shame burned hot in her chest, warring with the fear. She pushed herself off the wall, her legs shaking. "I did not invite anything," she whispered, though no one was listening. Miller turned back to Eli, poking a finger into his chest. "You pay for this table, stranger. And then you get out. If I see you starting brawls again, I will run you out of town on a rail. Do you hear me?" Eli looked at the sheriff, his expression stony. He reached into his pocket and pulled out $3 silver, nearly all the money he had left. He tossed them onto the wet bar top. "That covers the damage," Eli said quietly. He turned and walked toward the door. The crowd parted for him, giving him a wide berth. He stopped near Clara. He did not touch her. He did not try to comfort her. He just jerked his head toward the door. "Go on," he said softly. "Get out of here." Clara didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her shawl and fled into the night, the laughter of the saloon chasing her out. Outside, the air was cool and shockingly still after the chaos inside. The desert wind had kicked up, swirling dust around the posts of the boardwalk. Clara leaned against a hitching post, gasping for breath, her whole body shaking as the adrenaline crashed out of her system. She felt humiliated, dirty, and terrified. She heard the heavy tread of boots on the wood planks. Eli stepped out of the saloon, putting on his hat. He stopped a few feet away from her. Clara looked at him. In the moonlight, the scar on his jaw looked stark white. She saw the blood on his knuckles. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her throat. The sheriff's words and the town's judgment hung between them. He had saved her. Yes, but in doing so, he had shone a spotlight on her shame. "Thank you," she said finally, the words stiff and formal. Her voice was brittle. "But I did not ask you to do that." Eli looked at her, his face shadowed. He seemed unsure of what to do with his hands, so he hooked his thumbs into his belt. "I know," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, but I could not watch it happen. "You made an enemy of the sheriff," Clara said, wrapping her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. "And for what? I am nobody here." Eli looked out at the dark street, at the stars that burned cold and bright above the sleeping town. He looked back at her, and for a moment, the distance between them vanished. He saw the bruise under her eye, the terror that she was trying to hide behind a wall of pride. And she saw the exhaustion in him, the weight of the violence he carried in those hands. "Nobody deserves to be handled like livestock." "Ma'am," Eli said, "not you, not anyone." He hesitated, as if he wanted to step closer, to offer to walk her home. But he saw the way she flinched when he shifted his weight. He saw the fear in her eyes that went deeper than just tonight. So he stayed where he was. "You best get home," he said. "I will," Clara said. They stood there for a heartbeat longer. Two broken things in a world that had no use for weakness. There was a recognition in that silence, a shared understanding of what it meant to be alone and hurting. Then, Clara turned and walked quickly down the alley toward her room, the sound of her boots fading into the wind. Eli watched her go until she was swallowed by the shadows. He looked down at his bleeding hand, flexed the fingers once, and then turned away, walking alone toward the livery stable under the cold, star-strewn sky. Red Butte was a town too small for secrets and far too small to avoid the people who knew them. In the weeks that followed the violence at the saloon, the paths of Clara and Eli crossed with the inevitability of the tides, though neither of them sought the other out. The town was a narrow strip of civilization carved out of the wilderness, and daily life forced them into the same dusty orbit. Clara saw him almost every morning. She would be standing on the boardwalk outside the laundry, pinning wet sheets to the lines that stretched across the alley, her mouth full of wooden clothespins. Eli would pass by on the main street, driving a buckboard wagon loaded with rough-cut lumber or cedar fence posts for the livery owner. He wore the same faded coat, his hat pulled low, his posture loose but alert. He never looked directly at her, but she felt his presence like a shift in the barometric pressure. One Tuesday, the wind tore a bundle of washed shirts from Clara's tired arms as she crossed the street to deliver them to the mercantile. The white fabric scattered into the red dirt. Before she could kneel, a shadow fell over her. Eli was there. He had been shoeing a horse nearby and had stepped out. Without a word, he knelt, his knees cracking in the dust, and gathered the shirts with those large, scarred hands. He shook the dust from them with a surprising delicacy before handing the bundle back to her. "Thank you," Clara murmured, clutching the linen to her chest as if it were armor. Eli just nodded, touching the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "No trouble, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest long after he had turned back to his work. That was all. No conversation, no demand for gratitude, just a quiet competence that unnerved her more than the leering shouts of the saloon patrons ever could. But if their days were filled with these silent intersections, their nights were consumed by the ghosts they carried. The trauma Clara bore was not just a memory. It lived in the marrow of her bones. The town of Red Butte was loud, filled with the cracking of whips, the shouting of drovers, and the occasional celebratory gunfire from men testing their aim on bottles at the edge of town. Every sudden bang sent a jolt of electricity through Clara's spine. When a passing wagon backfired or a heavy crate was dropped on the boardwalk, she would flinch so violently that she nearly dropped her work. Her breath would vanish, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs until she realized she was not back in that house in St. Louis. Her nights were worse. In the suffocating heat of her small room, she would sit on the edge of her narrow cot, the moonlight slicing through the gaps in the wall planks. She would roll up the sleeves of her nightdress and trace the silver-white lines of old scars on her arms, maps of pain left by a man who had promised to love her. The memories came unbidden, pulling her back to a life of velvet curtains and cigar smoke. She remembered the smell of stale brandy and the sound of Jasper's voice, charming to his friends but razor-sharp when they were alone. But the worst memory, the one that made her curl into a ball and press her hands over her ears, was the memory of the stairs. It had been a Tuesday, much like this one. She remembered the weight of the laundry basket in her arms then, too. She remembered the argument. Jasper needed money for a debt, money she had set aside for the doctor. She remembered his face, twisted with a rage that turned him into a stranger. And she remembered the shove. It had been sharp, decisive. She recalled the sensation of falling, the terrible weightlessness, and then the crushing impact of the floorboards. But the pain of her broken arm had been nothing compared to the silence that followed. The silence from her womb. The silence in the crib that would never be filled. She remembered waking up in a haze of agony, and Jasper standing over her, his face cold, telling her it was her own clumsiness, her own fault that they had lost the baby. He had called her useless. He had told her she would have to work to pay off what he owed, suggesting she speak to his friends in the gambling hall. That was the night the steel had entered Clara's spine. She had waited until he passed out from drink. She had taken the roll of banknotes from his coat pocket, money he had won cheating a stranger, and she had run. She had run until her shoes fell apart, heading north and west, following rumors of cattle towns where a woman could disappear. Now, sitting in Red Butte, she touched the locket around her neck. Rose. She whispered the name into the dark. "I am trying. Rose, I am trying to be safe." Eli, too, was haunted, though his ghosts walked in the daylight as often as the dark. He found work riding out to the edges of the valley to mend fences for the Circle T ranch. It was brutal, lonely work, miles from the nearest human voice, and that suited him. Out there, with nothing but the wind and the hawks, he could almost forget the weight of his own history. Almost. At midday, when the sun beat down like a hammer, he would strip off his shirt to wash in the shallow creek that ran through the cottonwoods. The water was cold, shocking the heat from his skin. As he scrubbed the sweat away, he would look down at his torso. It was a tapestry of violence. There was a puckered crater on his left shoulder from a rifle ball in '69, a long, thin slash across his ribs from a knife fight in a border cantina. But it was the invisible scars that pulled at him. He would sit on the bank, drying in the sun, and the memory of Abilene would overlay the peaceful landscape. He could smell the gunpowder. He could feel the heavy, balanced weight of the Colt in his hand. Kid Weaver had been his name. A boy. Really, with eyes too bright and a temper too hot, the kid had called him out in the street, wanting to make a name for himself by killing the man they said was the fastest gun in the territory. Eli had tried to walk away. He had turned his back, but the kid had fired, the bullet kicking up dirt at Eli's heel. Eli remembered the turn. It was muscle memory, faster than thought. The draw, the level, the squeeze. The kid had fallen backward as if kicked by a mule, a hole in his chest that ended his story before it had truly begun. It was a fair fight. The sheriff in Abilene had said, self-defense, clear as day. But Eli knew there was nothing fair about being better at killing than another man. He looked at his hands now, calloused and stained with fence grease. They were strong hands, capable hands, but he could not wash the feeling of the gun out of them. In Red Butte, the rumors were already swirling. Men watched him from the shade of the livery stable. They whispered that he had ridden with Quantrill during the war, or that he had been a hired killer for the railroads in Wyoming. They said a man did not get that quiet unless he had buried a lot of bodies. Eli let them talk. The truth was simpler and heavier. He was just a man who had survived, and he was tired of apologizing for it. Yet, in this landscape of hard earth and harder memories, small green shoots of connection began to grow between Clara and Eli, almost against their will. It started with the apples. Fresh fruit was a rarity in Red Butte, expensive and hard to keep. One morning, Clara opened the back door of the laundry to find a small burlap sack sitting on the step. Inside were 4 red apples, crisp and smelling of sweet rain. There was no note, but she had seen Eli unloading a shipment of produce at the general store the day before. She knew the cost of them was likely half a day's wages for him. She ate one that night, slicing it slowly, the sweetness bringing tears to her eyes that she angrily wiped away. A week later, Eli brought his laundry to the back door. He handed her a bundle of shirts, his face impassive. Just the wash. Ma'am, he said. When Clara unfolded them, she found his gray flannel work shirt had a tear in the shoulder, likely from a snag on a barbed wire fence. It was a jagged rip. He had not asked for mending. Mending cost extra, and he paid only for washing. Clara washed the shirt until the water ran clear. Then, she sat by the oil lamp in her room, taking out her small sewing kit. She chose a gray thread that matched perfectly, with tiny, precise stitches. She closed the tear. She reinforced the fabric from behind, making the mend stronger than the original weave. It was an act of care she could not voice. When Eli came to collect his washing, he checked the bundle. He stopped when he saw the shirt. He ran his thumb over the stitching, feeling the neat, flat ridge of the repair. He looked up at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You did not have to do this," he said, his voice gruff. "It would have unraveled in the wash otherwise," Clara said, looking past him at the dust motes dancing in the air. "I cannot have my customers walking around in rags. It reflects poorly on my work." Eli studied her for a moment longer. "It is good work. Clara, thank you." It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it in his deep, rough voice made her skin prickle. "We are in for a blow," he added, glancing at the sky, shifting the subject to the safe territory of the weather. "The wind is turning around to the north." Clara nodded, hugging her arms. "The air feels heavy, like it is holding its breath. It is going to get dry." Eli said, "You keep your door bolted when the dust comes. It gets into everything." "I always keep my door bolted," Clara said softly. Eli looked at her, and the double meaning hung between them for a second. "I know you do," he said, and then he turned and walked away. clutching his mended shirt. The land, indifferent to their fragile truce, began to turn cruel. A week later, the dust storm arrived. It began as a brown bruise on the northern horizon, swallowing the red buttes one by one. By noon, the sun was a pale, sickly coin behind a veil of flying grit. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the buildings, carrying sand that scoured the paint from the walls and hissed like snakes under the eaves. The town shut down. Windows were shuttered. Rags were stuffed into cracks. For 3 days, the wind howled. Inside her room, Clara tied a handkerchief over her mouth and nose, coughing as the fine red dust coated everything. Her bed, her wash basin, her hair. It felt like the earth itself was trying to bury them. When the wind finally died, it left behind a drought that tightened its grip on the valley. The river dropped low, exposing muddy banks that stank of rot. The wells began to run dry. Cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their hides as the grass turned to brittle straw. With the heat came tension. Men grew meaner. In the saloon, the laughter became sharper, the arguments more frequent. The fear of losing their herds made the ranchers edgy, and they looked for someone to blame for their misfortune. The power in Red Butte lay in the hands of 2 men, Sheriff Miller, who wore the law like a club, and Barrett, a wealthy cattleman who owned half the valley and held the notes on the other half. Barrett was a man with cold eyes and a soft, dangerous voice. He was also, Clara soon learned, a business associate of Jasper's from back east. Clara saw them standing outside the sheriff's office one afternoon as she walked to the post office. Barrett was smoking a cigar, dressed in a fine black suit that seemed immune to the dust. "That is her?" Barrett asked, not bothering to lower his voice. Sheriff Miller nodded, spitting onto the boardwalk. "That is the one. Drifter. Claims she is a widow, but I have seen her kind before." Barrett watched Clara with a look of predatory assessment. "I had a letter from a friend in St. Louis, man named Jasper. Said his wife ran off with a substantial sum of his money. Said she was unstable, prone to fits." Clara's blood ran cold. She kept walking, staring straight ahead, her heart hammering against her ribs. They knew, or they suspected. Later that day, Barrett cornered Eli at the livery stable. Eli was oiling a harness, his hands slick with grease. Barrett stood in the doorway, blocking the light. "You are the one they call Eli," Barrett said. Eli did not look up. "I am. I hear you are handy with a gun," Barrett said. "I have got some work on the range. Discouraging squatters. It pays well." "I am not a hired gun," Eli said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I mend fences. I tend horses." Barrett stepped closer, his boots crunching on the straw. "A man with your history should not be wasting his time playing nursemaid to ponies. And he certainly should not be wasting his time playing hero to fallen women." Eli stopped moving. He looked up slowly, meeting Barrett's gaze. "I heard about the saloon," Barrett continued, smiling thinly. "Sheriff Miller tells me you got into a brawl over that laundress. You should be careful. Friend, women like her, they are damaged goods. They drag a man down into the mud with them. You stick to your own kind." Eli stood up. He towered over Barrett, though he made no move to strike him. "My kind," Eli said quietly, "are the ones who mind their own business. I suggest you do the same." Barrett's smile vanished. He stared at Eli for a long moment, measuring him. Then he turned and walked out. "You will find that this town gets very small for people who do not know their place." He called back over his shoulder. The warning was clear. The net was tightening. The breaking point came on a Saturday night. The saloon was stifling, the heat clinging to the room like a wet wool blanket. Clara had sung for 2 hours, her throat raw, her head pounding. The patrons had been particularly vicious, shouting crude suggestions, laughing when she stumbled over a lyric. One man had thrown a coin at her, hitting her in the cheek, leaving a stinging red mark. She could not take it anymore. She fled the stage, ignoring Mr. Sullivan's calls, and pushed her way out the back door into the alley. She needed water. She needed to wash the feeling of their eyes off her skin. She hurried toward the water trough that stood near the livery stable, the only source of clean water this late at night. She was shaking so hard she could barely hold the wooden bucket. She dipped it into the trough, the water black and glassy in the moonlight. As she tried to lift it, her hands spasmed. The heavy bucket slipped from her wet fingers. It did not hit the ground. A hand caught the rope handle inches before it struck the dirt. Eli was there. He had been washing his face at the other end of the trough, stripped to his undershirt, the water dripping from his beard and hair. He steadied the bucket and set it down gently. "Careful," he said softly. Clara gasped, stepping back. In the moonlight, she saw him clearly, the wet fabric of his shirt clinging to his chest, the scars on his arms, the dark intensity of his eyes. He reached out, perhaps to steady her, perhaps just to ensure she didn't fall. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed against the back of her hand. The reaction was instantaneous. Clara froze. The sensation of his skin against hers was not the violent grab she expected. It was warm. It was solid. It was terrifyingly gentle. For a heartbeat, she stood paralyzed, feeling the heat of his hand seep into her cold skin. It was a connection so raw, so human, that it cut through all her defenses. Then the panic surged. She snatched her hand away as if she had been burned, stumbling back until she hit the rough wood of the stable wall. "I am sorry," she gasped, her voice high and frantic. "I did not mean to. I just needed water." Eli did not move toward her. He stayed where he was, his hand still suspended in the air where hers had been. He lowered it slowly. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Clara," he said. His voice was different tonight, stripped of its usual guard. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, sliding down the wall until she was crouching in the dirt. The tears she had been holding back for weeks finally broke free. She sobbed, a harsh, jagged sound that tore at her throat. "I cannot do this," she wept. "I cannot be here." "They look at me like I am dirt," they say. "Let them say what they want," Eli said. He crouched down, keeping his distance, sitting on his heels in the dust. "They are small men with small minds." "You do not understand," Clara whispered, looking up at him, her face streaked with tears and dust. "I am not like you. You can fight them. I am ruined. I have nothing left. I do not deserve a decent life anymore." Eli looked at her, and the pain in his eyes mirrored her own. He looked down at his hands, turning them over in the moonlight. "You think you are the only one?" he asked. His voice was low, laced with a bitter gravel. "Look at me, Clara. I have killed men. I have taken lives that belong to mothers and fathers. I wake up every morning and I have to remember that I am the reason someone else is not breathing." He looked up at her, his expression raw. "You say you are ruined. I am the one who ruins things. I have done terrible things to survive, but I still get up. I still try to be a man who does not use these hands for hurting. Not anymore." Clara stared at him. She saw the guilt that ate at him, the same way her fear ate at her. She saw that his strength was not a gift, but a burden he carried. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why do you help me? They told you to stay away." Eli looked at her, and for the first time, he let the wall down completely. "Because when I look at you," he said, "I see the only thing in this town that is real. You are fighting a war, Clara, just like me, and I will be damned if I let you fight it alone." The silence that followed was thick with unsaid things. The air between them seemed to hum with a sudden, terrifying tension. It was not just gratitude anymore. It was not just pity. Clara looked at his mouth, then at his eyes. She felt a pull in her chest, a physical ache to bridge the distance between them. She wanted, with a sudden, desperate fierceness, to crawl across the dust and feel those rough hands hold her together. She wanted to know if his touch could heal the places that had been broken, but the fear was still there, a cold chain around her ankle. She stood up, her legs shaking. She picked up the bucket of water. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered. Eli stood as well. He did not step closer, but his gaze held hers. intense and burning. "Good night, Clara." She turned and walked back toward the laundry, the water splashing against her skirt. She could feel his eyes on her back. She could feel the imprint of his fingers on her hand like a brand, hot and throbbing. Eli watched her go. He stood by the trough long after she had disappeared into the shadows of the alley. His jaw was tight, his teeth clenched. He looked down at his hand, the hand that had touched her. He made a fist, fighting the overwhelming urge to follow her, to stand outside her door, to make sure no one ever hurt her again. He turned back to the dark stable, his heart pounding a heavy, dangerous rhythm against his ribs. That night, neither of them slept. Clara lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. She held her hand up in the darkness, tracing the spot where his skin had brushed hers. It terrified her, the want, the sudden, overwhelming hunger to be touched, not with violence, but with that rough, careful reverence he had shown. It was a dangerous hope, and hope, she knew, could kill you faster than a bullet. In the stable loft, Eli lay with his arm over his eyes. He listened to the wind rattling the roof. He thought of Clara's eyes, wide and wet with tears. He thought of the curve of her neck and the sound of her breathing. He knew he should leave. He knew he was no good for a woman like that, a woman trying to heal. He was a man of violence, and violence always followed him. But as the moon set over the red buttes, leaving the world in darkness, Eli knew he wasn't going anywhere. He was terrified of what he was feeling, but he was more terrified of a world where she was alone. The stagecoach from the railhead at Cheyenne arrived in Red Butte on a Thursday afternoon, kicking up a plume of yellow dust that hung in the stagnant air like a shroud. It was a Concord coach, painted a fading red, its leather thoroughbraces creaking under the weight of luggage and mail. It rolled to a halt in front of the drover's rest, the horses blowing hard, their flanks lathered with sweat. Clara was scrubbing the boardwalk in front of the laundry, a task she performed every afternoon. She paused, leaning on her broom, wiping a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She did not usually pay attention to the stage, but a sudden chill, unrelated to the weather, pricked the skin of her neck. The door of the coach opened. A boot emerged, polished to a high black shine, devoid of dust or mud. Then a man stepped down. He was not a rancher, nor a drover. He wore a suit of dark gray broadcloth, cut in the Eastern fashion, and a silk vest embroidered with silver thread. His hat was a bowler, not a Stetson. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes the color of winter ice. Clara stopped breathing. The broom slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the wooden planks. The sound seemed deafening in the sudden silence of her own mind. It was Jasper. He stood on the street, adjusting his cuffs, looking around the rough town with an expression of amused distaste. He did not see her at first. He turned to the driver, speaking in a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat, smooth, cultivated, and laced with an undercurrent of menace. "Get my bags," he said, "and be quick about it." Clara stepped back, her heel catching on the threshold of the laundry door. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her light-headed. She retreated into the shadows of the shop, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He had found her. The vastness of the West, the miles of empty plain, the anonymity of her poverty. None of it had been enough. Jasper did not go to the hotel. He walked straight to the sheriff's office, dusting his sleeves with a gloved hand. Inside, Sheriff Miller and Barrett, the cattleman who held the town's debt, were waiting. The meeting was brief and conducted with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. Jasper laid a sheaf of papers on the sheriff's desk. They were legal documents, stamped with the seal of a judge in St. Louis. "She is my wife," Jasper said, his voice level. "And she is in possession of property that belongs to me, a substantial sum of money, and herself. The law is quite clear. Sheriff, a wife cannot steal from her husband because she has no property separate from him, but she can be retrieved, like a runaway horse." Barrett lit a cigar. studying the newcomer. "You are sure she is here? I have my sources," Jasper said, a thin smile touching his lips. "A tracker is only as good as the gold you pay him. I want her back, and I want the man she has been consorting with dealt with. I hear there is a drifter who fancies himself her protector." Miller nodded, eyeing the expensive cut of Jasper's coat. "We know him. He is a nuisance. We will handle the drifter. You just make sure your claim is tight. It is ironclad," Jasper said. The news spread through Red Butte faster than a prairie fire. By evening, everyone knew. The quiet washerwoman was not a widow. She was a runaway, a thief, a woman who had abandoned her lawful husband to play house in a cattle town. The sympathy of the few women who had spoken to her evaporated, replaced by the righteous indignation of the morally superior. The men at the saloon smirked, making crude bets on how long it would take the city man to break her. The confrontation happened the next morning. Clara could not hide forever. She had to work to eat. She was carrying a basket of linens toward the hotel when she saw him. He was waiting for her outside the saloon, leaning against a post, smoking a thin cheroot. When she stepped into the street, he straightened up. "Clara," he called out. The sound of her name in his mouth made her knees buckle. She stopped, the basket trembling in her hands. He walked toward her, not rushing, savoring the moment. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough for her to smell the bay rum he used, a scent that brought back the memory of terror so vivid she almost gagged. "Hello, my dear," Jasper said. His tone was mockingly sweet, the voice one uses for a slow-witted child or a disobedient pet. "You have led me on quite a chase." Clara stared at him, her throat constricted. "Go away," she whispered. Jasper laughed softly. "Go away? After I came all this way to fetch you? Do not be absurd. Look at you. You are thin, and these hands." He reached out and took her hand before she could pull away. He inspected her cracked, red fingers with a look of theatrical pity. "Ruined." He tisked. "This is no work for a lady. But then, you stopped acting like a lady the night you stole from me and ran off like a common thief. I earned that money," Clara said, her voice shaking but audible. "I earned it with every bruise you gave me." Jasper's eyes hardened, the ice cracking through the facade. "Lower your voice," he hissed, squeezing her fingers until the knuckles ground together. "You are my wife. You are my property. And you are coming back with me on the stage tomorrow. Your little adventure is over." He let go of her hand with a shove. "I will see you at dinner. Clara, do not make me come drag you out of that hovel you are living in." He turned and walked into the saloon, leaving her standing in the dust, the eyes of the town burning into her back. The law came for her an hour later. Sheriff Miller stood in the doorway of the laundry. Filling the frame, he held a folded document. "This says you are legally bound to Mr. Jasper Thorne," Miller said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a slamming door. "The law says you go where he goes. You have got no rights to be here on your own if he claims you." "He beats me," Clara said, desperation rising in her chest. "He nearly killed me." Miller shrugged. "That is a domestic matter, ma'am. Not my jurisdiction. The law concerns property and marriage rights. You best pack your things." Even her sanctuary was stripped away. The landlord, a man who had always taken her rent with a grunt, met her at the bottom of the stairs. "I want you out by morning," he said, refusing to meet her eyes. "Mr. Thorne paid me for the room. He says he wants his wife in the hotel, not a shed. I do not want trouble with the law. Mrs." Clara felt the walls of the world closing in. She was trapped. Every institution, marriage, law, commerce, was designed to hold her in place, to hand her back to the man who would destroy her. She had only one place left to go. She ran to the livery stable. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, bloody shadows across the dirt floor. Eli was in the back, pitching hay into the loft. He heard her running steps and turned, his pitchfork pausing in midair. One look at her face was all he needed. He drove the tines of the fork into a bale and climbed down the ladder in 2 swift movements. "Clara?" he said. She collided with him, grabbing the front of his shirt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "He is here," she choked out. "Jasper, he is here." Eli's hands came up to grip her shoulders, steadying her. He felt the tremors racking her body. His face went dark, a storm cloud passing over the sun. "The gambler?" Eli asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, he has papers. The sheriff. Everyone says I have to go back. They say I belong to him." Clara looked up at him, tears streaking the dust on her face. She confessed it all then, the words tumbling out in a torrent. "I lost a baby. Eli. He pushed me down the stairs because I would not give him money for his debts. I woke up and the baby was gone, and he blamed me. He said I was clumsy. He said I owed him for the loss. That is why I took the money. That is why I ran. If I go back, he will kill me, or he will make me wish I was dead." Eli listened, and with every word, the muscles in his jaw tightened until they looked like carved stone. His hands, still holding her shoulders, clenched. He felt a rage so pure and white-hot that it blinded him for a second. He wanted to walk into the hotel, find the man in the gray suit, and beat him until he never stood up again. But he looked at Clara. She was terrified. She did not need a murderer. She needed a way out. He forced his hands to relax, forcing the violence down into the pit of his stomach where it burned like a coal. "You are not going back," Eli said. The certainty in his voice was the only solid thing in her spinning world. But the sheriff. Clara began. "To hell with the sheriff," Eli said, "and to hell with his papers." He stepped back, his mind working fast. "We cannot fight them here. The law in this town is bought and paid for. Miller will hand you over, and Barrett will help him just to spite me. We need a real judge, a circuit judge." "Where?" Clara asked. "Silver Creek." Eli said, "It is 3 days hard riding south. Over the pass. There is a federal courthouse there. If we can get you in front of a judge who is not in Barrett's pocket, we can challenge the claim. We can testify to the abuse. We can get an annulment or a writ of separation." 3 days, Clara whispered. "We leave tonight," Eli said, "before dawn. If we wait until morning, the sheriff will be watching." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "It will be hard riding. Clara, we have one horse. We will have to move fast and sleep rough. And if they catch us, I will not let them catch us," Eli vowed. They met 2 hours before sunrise at the edge of town, behind the ruins of an old mission church. The air was cold enough to frost breath. Eli had the big dust-colored geldings saddled and packed with a bedroll, 2 canteens, and a saddlebag of dried meat and biscuits. He had stolen nothing. The supplies were bought with his last wages. The horse was borrowed against his labor owed to the livery owner, a complication he would deal with later. Clara wore her warmest dress and a heavy wool shawl. She carried only her carpet bag. She looked at the horse, then at Eli. "Up you go," Eli said. He lifted her easily, swinging her into the saddle. He swung up behind her, settling into the limited space on the cantle. His arms came around her to take the reins. For a moment, the intimacy of it shocked them both. Clara could feel the hard wall of his chest against her back. Eli could smell the soap in her hair and feel the trembling of her body. "Lean back," Eli murmured, his mouth close to her ear. "We have a long way to go." They rode out into the darkness, leaving Red Butte and its judgment behind them. The land did not welcome them. As the sun rose, the plains turned into a furnace. The wind that had scoured the town was absent here, replaced by a stillness that magnified the heat. They rode through a landscape of brown scrub and cracked earth, the dust rising in puffs under the geldings' hooves. They had to ration the water. Eli gave most of it to the horse and to Clara, barely wetting his own lips. By the second afternoon, Clara's lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin felt tight, stretched over her bones like parchment. At night, the coyotes howled from the ridges, a lonely, yipping chorus that made the vastness of the dark feel oppressive. The temperature plummeted as soon as the sun dropped, the desert swinging from oven to icebox in the span of an hour. On the second night, the wind returned. It was a biting norther, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. They camped in the lee of a rock overhang, but it offered little shelter. They had only one blanket. Eli built a small fire from sagebrush and dried roots. It flickered weakly, offering more light than heat. Clara sat by the fire, shivering violently, her teeth chattering. "You are freezing," Eli said. He was sitting on a rock a few feet away, his coat collar turned up, shivering himself though he tried to hide it. "I am fine," Clara lied, wrapping her arms around her knees. "You are not fine," Eli said. "And neither am I." He stood up and picked up the heavy wool blanket from where it lay on his saddle. He walked over to her. "We have to share it, Clara, or we will both be sick by morning." Clara looked up at him. The fear of touch was still there, a reflex honed by years of pain. But looking at Eli, his face gray with fatigue, his eyes kind, she felt something else, a longing, a need for warmth that was deeper than just escaping the cold. She nodded. Eli sat down beside her, close but not touching. He spread the blanket over both of their shoulders, creating a cocoon against the wind. "Come here," he said gently. Clara hesitated, then shifted closer. She leaned against him. The contact was electric. She could feel the heat of his body through his clothes, a steady, solid warmth that seemed to seep into her frozen marrow. Eli's arm went around her shoulders to hold the blanket in place. His hand was careful, his fingers resting lightly on her arm, exerting no pressure. He was terrified of frightening her. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sparks fly up into the black sky. "I do not know how to do this," Clara whispered suddenly. "Do what?" Eli asked, his voice a rumble in his chest against her ear. "This, being close to someone without being afraid. Every time you move, my body braces for a hit. I hate it. I hate that he broke me like that." Eli's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder, then relaxed. "You are not broken. Clara, you are hurt. There is a difference. Bones knit, skin heals. It is not my bones," she said. "It is my mind. I look at you and I want to be close to you. I want it so much it scares me more than he does." Eli turned his head, looking down at her. Her face was inches from his, pale in the firelight. Her eyes were wide, searching his. "I am scared too," Eli admitted, his voice ragged. "You?" Clara asked. "You are not scared of anything. I am scared of wanting you," Eli said. The truth hung in the air between them, stark and undeniable. "I am a man with blood on his hands. Clara, I have got nothing to offer a woman but a hard life and a bad reputation. I'm afraid if I touch you the way I want to, I will ruin the only good thing I have ever found." Clara turned her body toward him, the blanket shifting. She reached up, her hand trembling, and touched the scar on his jaw. "You are not a bad man. Eli, you are the man who saved me." She leaned in, her breath ghosted against his lips. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to pull her into him and never let go. He leaned forward, closing the distance, but at the last second, just as their lips were about to brush, Clara flinched, a tiny, involuntary spasm of panic. She pulled back, gasping, her eyes squeezing shut. "I can't," she panted. "I am sorry. I can't yet." Eli stopped immediately. He did not push. He did not sigh with frustration. He simply rested his forehead against hers for a moment, his breathing heavy. "It is all right," he whispered. "It is all right, Clara. We sleep. That is all." He settled back against the rock, pulling her head down to rest on his chest. He held her there, staring out into the dark, his body aching with desire, but his will absolute. He would wait. He would wait forever if he had to. The danger found them the next afternoon. They were riding through a narrow canyon, the walls rising steep and red on either side. The terrain was rough, forcing the horse to pick its way slowly through scree and mesquite. Eli heard it first, the strike of a horseshoe on stone, echoing from behind them. He pulled the gelding to a halt, turning in the saddle. Far back, at the mouth of the canyon, 3 riders were silhouetted against the bright sky. They were moving fast, pushing their mounts. "Men?" Clara asked, feeling the tension in Eli's body. "Trackers," Eli said grimly. Jasper did not come alone. He hired men to do his dirty work. He spurred the gelding. "Yeah, let's go, boy." The tired horse surged forward. The chase was on. They scrambled up a steep incline, sliding in the loose rock. A gunshot cracked through the air, a rifle shot, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls. A puff of dust exploded from a rock 3 feet to their left. "They are shooting!" Clara cried, gripping Eli's waist. "They are trying to spook the horse!" Eli shouted over the wind. "Keep your head down." They crested a ridge and plunged down into a ravine, seeking the cover of the brush. The terrain was too rough for speed. It became a game of hide and seek. Eli pulled the horse up behind a cluster of boulders. He slid off, pulling his Winchester rifle from the scabbard. "Stay with the horse," he commanded. "Keep his head down." He climbed the rocks, peering over the edge. The 3 riders were closing in, moving cautiously now, rifles drawn. They were hard men, wearing long dusters, the kind who killed for pay and slept soundly after. Eli raised the rifle. His hands, usually so rough, were steady as stone now. He did not aim to kill. Not yet. He needed to slow them down. He fired. The lead rider's horse reared as a bullet struck the ground inches from its hooves. Eli worked the lever, firing again, putting a round through the crown of the second man's hat. The riders scattered, diving for cover behind rocks. "He has got a rifle," one of them shouted. Eli fired a 3rd shot, chipping rock above their heads. "Go back," he roared, his voice echoing in the ravine. "Next one goes in a belly." He scrambled back down to Clara. She was crouching by the horse, her face white, gripping the reins with white knuckles. "Did you kill them?" she asked. "I bought us time," Eli said, shoving the rifle back into the scabbard. "But they will flank us if we stay. We have to move on foot. The horse cannot make the climb up that scree." He slapped the gelding on the rump, sending it trotting down the canyon to draw their fire. Then he grabbed Clara's hand. "Run," he said. They scrambled up the backside of the ravine, slipping on shale, tearing their clothes on thorns. Clara's lungs burned. Her legs felt like lead. But Eli's hand was an anchor, pulling her up, hauling her over ledges. They climbed until the sun began to set, turning the sky a bruised purple. They had shaken the pursuers, at least for the night, but they were exhausted, waterless and exposed. Then, in the twilight, they saw it. An old line cabin, tucked into a fold of the mountain. It was little more than a shack of gray timber, half collapsed, but it was shelter. They stumbled inside, kicking the door shut against the rising wind. The cabin was small, smelling of rat droppings and old pine needles. Clara collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor. She was breathing hard, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and dust. She looked at Eli. He was leaning against the door, listening. He looked at his hands. His knuckles were bloodied from the climb, the skin torn. "We made it," he rasped. Clara stared at his hands, those rough, bleeding hands that had held a gun to save her, that had pulled her up the mountain, that had held the blanket with such gentleness. The night pressed in outside, vast and dangerous. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of their fear and their exertion. Clara felt a knot tighten in her chest, a tangle of terror for what was behind them, and a fierce, overwhelming gratitude for the man standing before her. She realized then, with a jolt that shook her more than the gunfire, that she would trust him with her life. She already had. The storm broke over the mountains with the violence of a hammer striking an anvil. What had begun as a biting wind shifted rapidly into a sleet that slashed sideways, rattling the loose shingles of the abandoned line cabin like a handful of gravel thrown against the wood. Inside, the air was damp and cold, smelling of ancient dust and the resin of the pine logs that made up the walls. Eli had managed to coax a fire to life in the stone hearth, using dry moss and the splintered remains of a broken chair found in the corner. The flames licked upward, casting long, dancing shadows that flickered against the rough timber. They were soaked through. The climb up the ravine had left them drenched in sweat, and the freezing rain had finished the job. "We need to get these clothes dry," Eli said. His voice was rough, barely audible over the wind howling outside. If we sleep in wet wool, the fever will take us before morning. He turned his back to her, moving to the far corner of the small room. He stripped off his heavy coat and his sodden shirt, hanging them on a nail driven into the log wall. The firelight played across his back, highlighting the ridge of his spine and the lattice of old white scars that crisscrossed his skin like a map of violent roads. Clara stood by the hearth, shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. She unbuttoned her dress with clumsy, frozen fingers. She stripped down to her chemise and petticoats, the fabric clinging damply to her skin. She laid her dress and shawl over a low beam near the fire. She tried not to look at him, but her eyes betrayed her. She saw the heavy muscle of his shoulders, the way the firelight caught the jagged scar on his ribs. He looked carved from the same hard rock as the mountains outside, enduring, battered, and dangerous. Eli turned back around, keeping his eyes strictly on her face, though the effort was visible in the tight line of his jaw. He saw her shivering, her arms wrapped around her chest, her skin pale and goose-fleshed. He picked up the single wool blanket they had carried. He walked over to her, his movements slow and deliberate, telegraphing his intent so as not to startle her. "Turn around." "Clara," he said softly. She turned, presenting her back to him. She felt the heavy warmth of the blanket settle over her shoulders, enclosing her in a cocoon of scratchy wool and the faint scent of horse and sage. Eli did not pull away immediately. His hands lingered on the edges of the blanket, pulling it tight across her chest to trap the heat. His thumb brushed against her collarbone, just above the neckline of her chemise. The touch was light, calloused, and electric. Clara stopped breathing. She felt the roughness of his skin, a texture like sandstone, against the softness of her own. It was a contrast that should have frightened her, but instead, it sent a sudden, piercing ache through her center. He stood there for a heartbeat, his breath warm on the back of her neck. Then he stepped back, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "Sit by the fire," he said. "You need the heat more than I do." They sat on the floor, the fire popping and hissing between them. Clara pulled the blanket tighter, watching Eli. He was checking his revolver, wiping the moisture from the steel with a rag, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, but she saw a smear of fresh blood on his cheek, a cut opened by a branch during their scramble up the slope. "You are bleeding," Clara said. Eli touched his cheek, looking at his fingertips. "It is nothing, just a scratch. It will fester if you leave it," Clara said. The words were automatic, a remnant of a life before, when she had tried to be a good wife who tended to things. "Let me clean it." Eli looked at her, surprised. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. He shifted closer to the light. Clara took a strip of clean cloth from her petticoat, a piece she had torn off earlier for a bandage, and dipped it into the small tin cup of water warming by the fire. She moved toward him. Her hand trembled as she reached out. This was not accidental contact. This was deliberate. She was crossing the line she had drawn in the sand of her own trauma. She touched the damp cloth to his cheek. Eli flinched, a tiny tightening of the muscles around his eyes, but he did not pull away. He sat, statue still, allowing her to work. Clara cleaned the cut, her eyes focused on the task to avoid meeting his gaze. She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. It was hard, covered in the rough stubble of a day's growth. Underneath the skin, she could feel the tension in him, the coiled energy of a man who was used to hitting back, now forcing himself to be passive under her hand. She realized, with a sudden swelling in her throat, that he was submitting to her. This dangerous man, who had held off 3 riders in a canyon, was letting her touch him, giving her the power to hurt him, trusting her not to. Her touch changed. It became less clinical, more searching. Her fingers lingered on the scar that ran along his jawline. "Does it hurt?" she whispered. "Not anymore," Eli said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating in the small space between them. He turned his head slightly, catching her wrist with his hand. His grip was loose, offering her an escape, but his eyes were dark and searching. "Why are you doing this?" "Clara," he asked, "you are afraid of me. I was, Clara admitted. Her voice shook. But you stayed. You could have ridden on. You could have left me to the sheriff. I do not leave people behind, Eli said. Not when I can help it. He released her wrist, but he did not move away. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them in the circle of amber light. The silence that followed was heavy, not with tension, but with the weight of things unsaid. I killed a man in Abilene, Eli said suddenly. He spoke to the fire, not to her, a boy. Really, his name was Weaver. He wanted to be famous. He thought putting a bullet in me was the way to do it. Clara watched his profile. She saw the guilt that etched deep lines around his mouth. He drew on me. Eli continued, his voice flat and hollow. It was fair. The law said it was fair. But I see his face when I sleep. I see him falling. I see his mother screaming in the street when they told her. I have been riding for 5 years trying to outrun that scream, but the map runs out. Clara, you cannot ride fast enough to leave yourself behind. Clara felt a crack in her own armor. She had held her pain close, hoarding it like a miser, afraid that sharing it would give it more power. But seeing his open wound, she knew she had to offer her own. I did not just lose the baby, she whispered. Eli turned to look at her. It was a girl, Clara said, the tears starting to spill hot and fast down her cheeks. I felt her move. I named her Sarah. I never told Jasper the name. He did not care. He wanted a son, or he wanted nothing. She took a shuddering breath, her hands twisting in the fabric of the blanket. That night, on the stairs, he was angry about a debt. He pushed me, and when I woke up, and the doctor told me she was gone, Jasper looked at me and said, you always were clumsy. Clara, try to be more careful next time. Like I had broken a teacup. Like she was nothing. A sob broke from her chest. Raw and ugly. He made me believe it was my fault. She choked out. For months, I thought I had killed her because I fell. I thought I deserved the bruises. Eli moved then. He shifted until he was sitting right beside her. He did not grab her. He simply offered his presence, a solid wall against the dark. It was not your fault, he said fiercely. His voice cracked. It was not your fault. Clara leaned her forehead against his shoulder. She could smell the rain and the smoke and the man. She let go. She cried for Sarah. She cried for the years of fear. She cried for the girl she had been before she learned to flinch. Eli sat with her, his own eyes wet, staring into the flames. He felt her grief vibrating through his own body. It hollowed him out, scouring away the hardness he had built up over the years, leaving something raw and new in its place. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. The fire burned down to coals. Clara's weeping subsided into soft, hitched panting. She did not pull away. She stayed leaning against him, wrapped in the blanket that covered them both now. She felt emptied out, lightheaded, but also strangely anchored. She shifted her head, her cheek resting against the rough wool of his shirt. I am so tired. Eli, she whispered. I know. He said, I am tired of being afraid. She said, I am tired of flinching. I want... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. What do you want? Eli asked softly. I want to feel something else, she said, her voice barely a breath. I want to know what it is like to be touched by hands that do not want to hurt me. I do not want to be alone in the dark anymore. The confession hung in the air, fragile as glass. Eli turned his body toward her. He reached up and took her face in his hands. His palms were rough, the calluses scraping gently against her skin. But his touch was infinitely tender. He held her face like it was something precious, something that could break if he wasn't careful. Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were swollen, her lips parted. She saw the hunger in his face, a stark, terrifying need, but she also saw the restraint. Eli, she breathed. He leaned down. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in the silence. His lips brushed hers, soft and dry. Clara made a small sound in her throat and pressed forward. The contact deepened. It wasn't the violent, taking kisses she had known with Jasper. It was a giving. Eli kissed her with a slow, burning intensity, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. Clara felt a jolt of heat travel down her spine, chasing away the cold of the storm. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the taste of him and the heat of the blanket. They shifted, bodies pressing together, the desire flaring up sudden and hot. Clara felt a desperation rising in her, a need to bury herself in him, to use his strength to blot out the memory of everything else. She pressed against him, a whimper escaping her lips. Eli pulled back. It cost him everything to do it. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut. His hands were still cupping her face, shaking slightly. "No," he rasped. Clara blinked, dazed. "Why?" "Because you are scared," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are running on fear and grief. Clara, if I take this, if we do this now, you might hate me for it in the morning, and I could not bear that." He opened his eyes. They were dark with want, but clear. "I want you, Clara. God, I want you. But not like this, not when you are desperate. I want you when you are free." Clara stared at him. She realized then that he was protecting her even from himself. He was placing her dignity above his own desire. She let out a long, shaky breath and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Eli kissed her forehead, a lingering seal of a promise. Then he pulled the blanket tighter around her and settled back against the wall, keeping his arm around her shoulders. "Sleep," he said. "I will watch the fire." The morning broke clear and sharp. The storm had scoured the world clean. The sky was a piercing, brilliant blue, and the air smelled of wet sage and freezing pine needles. The red rocks of the canyon glittered with melting frost. They rode out in silence, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall between them. It was a bridge. Clara sat behind Eli on the gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist. She did not hold herself stiffly away anymore. She leaned into him, her body adjusting to the rhythm of the horse and the man. Occasionally, she would rest her cheek against his back, or squeeze his arm when they saw a hawk circling overhead. Eli rode with a new alertness. He felt the warmth of her against his spine, and it gave him a singular, terrifying focus. He was not just surviving anymore. He was guarding something. When he looked back at her to point out the trail, his eyes were softer. The guarded wariness was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. They were two scarred people who had found a way to fit their broken pieces together. By late afternoon, the terrain began to flatten out. The muddy ruts of a wagon road appeared, leading them toward the gray smudge of smoke on the horizon that was Silver Creek. Silver Creek was larger than Red Butte, but it lacked the raw, dusty honesty of the cattle town. It was a mining and government hub, a place of brick buildings and false fronts, where the streets were churned into a thick, clinging gumbo by the recent rain. They rode down the main thoroughfare, the gelding splashing through puddles that reflected the graying sky. Strangers on the boardwalks watched them pass with suspicious eyes, a rough cowboy on a tired horse with a woman who looked too worn for her age clinging to his back. They found the courthouse, a square, imposing building of red brick with white pillars that looked out of place in the mud. Eli helped Clara down. Her legs were stiff, and she stumbled slightly. He caught her, his hands lingering on her waist for a second longer than necessary. "Ready?" he asked. Clara smoothed her wrinkled dress and adjusted her shawl. She touched the locket at her throat. "Ready," she said, though her stomach was twisting in knots. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and paper dust. They were directed to the chambers of Circuit Judge Vance. Judge Vance was a man who looked as if he had been dried out in the sun too long. He was thin, with skin like parchment and spectacles that magnified his watery, judgmental eyes. He sat behind a heavy oak desk, looking over the top of a ledger as Clara and Eli entered. "State your business," Vance said, not offering them a seat. Clara stepped forward. Her voice was small but clear. "I am seeking protection. Your Honor, from my husband. I need an annulment, or a legal separation. Vance took off his spectacles and polished them slowly. On what grounds? Cruelty, Clara said. And endangerment. He beat me. I lost a child because of his violence. Vance frowned, as if she had mentioned something distasteful like a spilled chamber pot. Domestic discipline is the right of a husband. Madam, unless you can prove he intended to kill you, the law is hesitant to intervene in the sanctity of marriage. He claims I am his property, Clara said, her voice rising. He is trying to force me back to him. Because you are his wife, Vance said coldly. That is the law. A wife's duty is to her husband's house. Did you leave him? Yes, Clara said. I had to. So you abandoned your post. Vance shook his head. You come into my court, admitting to desertion, and ask me to absolve you of your vows. This is not how the law works. Young woman. Before Clara could answer, the door behind them opened. Sheriff Miller from Red Butte walked in, knocking the mud from his boots. And behind him walked Jasper Thorne. Jasper looked fresh, clean, and utterly in control. He held a leather satchel. I believe I can clear this up. Your Honor, Jasper said, his voice smooth as oil. Clara gasped, backing up until she hit Eli's chest. Eli's hand went to his gun belt, but he didn't draw. Not in a courthouse, not yet. And you are? Judge Vance asked. Jasper Thorne, the man said, bowing slightly, the husband of this confused, hysterical woman. I have traveled a long way to retrieve her for her own care. He stepped forward and placed a document on the judge's desk. And here, Your Honor, is a sworn affidavit from the sheriff of her hometown, attesting to her theft of my funds and her history of mental instability. She is not well. Judge, she imagines things. Vance picked up the paper. Reading it, he nodded slowly. This seems in order. Vance said, It is a lie, Clara cried. She stepped forward, slamming her hands on the desk. He paid them. He paid the sheriff. Look at my arms. Look at the scars. Vance looked at her with distaste. Hysteria, just as the gentleman says. Judge, Eli stepped in, his voice deep and commanding. Listen to her. I found her hiding in a laundry, working her fingers to the bone to stay away from this man. You do not run like that unless you are running for your life. Vance looked at Eli. And who are you? The paramour? The man aiding in this desertion? I am a witness, Eli said. Jasper laughed softly. A witness? You are a drifter, a saddle tramp with a gun. Your word is worth less than the mud on your boots in a court of law. Clara looked from the judge to Jasper. She saw the look passing between them, the shared understanding of men of status. She realized with a crushing weight that the truth did not matter here. The law was a wall, and she was on the wrong side of it. Judge, Jasper said, sliding a heavy envelope across the desk. It clinked with the sound of gold coins. I apologize for the trouble my wife has caused. I am happy to pay any court costs associated with filing the proper paperwork to have her returned to my custody. Vance placed his hand over the envelope. He cleared his throat. I will need time to review the case. Vance said, I cannot make a ruling today. Stalling. He was stalling until the bribe could be counted and the papers stamped. He is buying you, Eli roared. Silence, Vance shouted, banging his gavel. One more word and I will have you arrested for contempt. Eli looked at Clara. She was pale, her eyes dead. She was giving up. He could see the light going out of her. He had to do something. He had to give her credibility. He had to prove that his word meant something, even if it cost him his freedom. He took a breath. My name is not just Eli, he said. His voice filled the room. Everyone stopped. My name is Elias Vance Putz. I was a deputy in Abilene in 71. I am the man who outdrew the kid weaver in the street. The silence in the room changed texture. It went from bureaucratic boredom to sudden, sharp interest. The gunfighter? Sheriff Miller asked. Squinting at him, I heard there was a warrant for questioning on you in Kansas. Some say that fight wasn't fair. It was fair, Eli said. His eyes locked on the judge. And I have never lied to the law. I am telling you now, on my name and my history. This man is a monster, and if you hand her back to him, you're signing her death warrant." Judge Vance looked at Eli with new eyes. Wary, calculating eyes. "Elias Putz." The judge mused. "There is a bounty on a man by that name? A substantial one, for jumping bail on a manslaughter charge related to that duel." "I did not jump bail," Eli said. "I left because the Weaver family hired men to kill me in my cell. That is for a court to decide," Vance said. He looked at the sheriff. "Detain him. We will check the wires on that warrant." "Eli, no!" Clara screamed. Two deputies moved from the corner of the room. Hands on their revolvers, Eli held up his hands. "I am not resisting," he said calmly. "But you look at the papers. Judge, you look at them." He looked at Clara. His eyes were burning with intensity. "Don't give up," he said to her. Sheriff Miller grabbed Eli's arms, pulling them behind his back. Jasper watched with a smirk of pure triumph. "Everything is falling into place," Jasper said softly to Clara. The deputies shoved Eli toward the door. The judge waved a hand. "Court is adjourned until morning. Mr. Thorne, ensure your wife does not leave town." "We will be at the hotel," Jasper said, taking Clara's arm. Clara wrenched her arm away. "Do not touch me," she hissed. She turned and ran out of the courtroom, following the deputies who were dragging Eli down the hall. They hauled him out the back door into the muddy street. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the gray clouds. The gas lamps were flickering to life, reflecting in the puddles. Clara caught up to them as they were shoving Eli toward the jailhouse. "Eli!" she cried. He stopped, digging his heels into the mud, forcing the deputies to pause. He looked at her. "Clara, listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "Why did you do that?" she sobbed, reaching for him. But a deputy blocked her path. "They will lock you up. They will send you back to Kansas." "It does not matter," Eli said. He looked at her, his rough face illuminated by the flickering street lamp. "I promised you," he said. "I promised I would not let you be broken. I will find a way. Clara, whatever it costs, I will free you from him." "Move it!" the deputy shouted, shoving Eli hard. Eli stumbled but kept his eyes on her until the jailhouse door slammed shut between them. Clara stood alone in the mud. The cold wind bit through her shawl. She was shaking, but not from the cold. Behind her, in the shadows of the alley, a figure watched. He wore a long duster and carried a rifle. He had heard the name in the courtroom, Elias Putz. The bounty hunter smiled, tipping his hat to the empty street. The price on the gunfighter's head was high, and now he was sitting in a cage, waiting to be plucked. Clara wiped her face. She looked at the jailhouse, then back toward the hotel where Jasper was waiting. She touched the locket at her throat. She was alone again, but she remembered the fire in the cabin. She remembered the touch of rough hands that did not hurt, and she knew, with a sudden, fierce clarity, that she would burn this whole town to the ground before she let Jasper win. The ride back to Red Butte was a funeral march in all but name. They traveled under a sky the color of a bruised plum, the air heavy with the static of a brewing storm. Judge Vance in Silver Creek, wary of the political fallout and the murky jurisdiction of the case, had ordered a final hearing to take place in Red Butte itself, where the alleged property rights were contested. He had released Eli on a tenuous bond, posted by a sympathetic storekeeper who remembered Eli's father, but the freedom was fragile as spun glass. When they rode down the main street of Red Butte, the town felt different. The silence was not the sleepy quiet of midday, but the held breath of a predator before the strike. The hooves of their single horse sounded like hammer strikes on the hard-packed earth. People watched from behind curtained windows and the shadowed recesses of porches. The rumors had traveled faster than the horse. Everyone knew. They knew Clara was a runaway wife, branded a thief by the fine gentleman in the suit. They knew Eli was a gunman with a price on his head, a killer trying to play the hero. As they passed the general store, two women stopped their conversation and turned their backs, pulling their shawls tight. A group of men on the bench fell silent, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, their eyes tracking Eli's hands near his gun belt. They think we are walking scandals, Clara said, her voice low. She sat behind Eli, her arms around his waist, but she held her head high. She was done hiding. Let them look, Eli said. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the rooftops, the alleyways. He felt the crosshairs of the town on his back. He knew that Jasper and Barrett would not wait for the hearing. They would make their move while the law was still fluid. They returned to the laundry, the only home Clara had. The lock had been broken. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside, the room had been tossed. Her few clothes were scattered on the floor, trampled by muddy boots. The mattress was slashed. It was a message, violent and clear. Eli stood in the doorway, his body rigid. "Stay behind me," he warned. But the violence was not waiting inside. It was gathering outside. An hour later, the sheriff arrived. He did not come alone. Sheriff Miller walked down the alley flanked by 2 deputies. Behind them, strolling with the casual arrogance of a man who owns the very air he breathes, was Jasper Thorne. And with him was Barrett, the cattleman, smoking a cigar that smelled of money and corruption. Clara stepped out onto the small porch, Eli a solid shadow at her right shoulder. "You are trespassing," Miller announced, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "This is my home." Clara said, "I paid the rent through the month. The landlord says different." Miller said, "He says the lease is void on account of moral turpitude and non-payment. Mr. Thorne here has graciously offered to cover the arrears, provided the property, that being you, is returned to his care." Jasper stepped forward. He looked at the wreckage of the room visible through the open door and tutted softly. "Look how you live, Clara," Jasper said. "Like an animal. It breaks my heart, but Mr. Barrett has been kind enough to offer a solution. Since you seem intent on staying in this charming town, he has a room for you at the back of his establishment." Clara went cold. She knew what the back rooms of Barrett's places were for. They were for women who had no choices left, women who were traded like currency to favored clients. "I am not going with you," Clara said. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "And I am not going to any back room." "You do not have a say, my dear," Jasper said, his voice hardening. "The law is clear. You are my wife, and if I choose to loan your services to Mr. Barrett to work off the debt you stole from me, that is my right." He waved a folded paper in the air. "A writ of reclamation, signed by the judge this morning." "It is a forgery," Eli growled, stepping down one step. "Or it is bought." Miller's hand dropped to his gun. "You watch your mouth, gunfighter. You are lucky you are not in irons right now. You interfere with a husband claiming his lawful wife, and I will shoot you where you stand." The threat hung in the thick, humid air. Clara looked at Jasper. She looked at the smirk on Barrett's face. She looked at the sheriff, a man sworn to protect, now acting as a pimp with a badge. Something inside her snapped. It was the final link of the chain she had dragged for 3 years. "No," Clara said. It was not a whisper. It was a shout. She stepped past Eli, down into the dirt of the alley, closing the distance between herself and the men. "No!" she screamed. People began to gather at the mouth of the alley. The shout had drawn them. The storekeeper, the blacksmith, the women who had turned their backs earlier. "I am not property," Clara yelled, her voice echoing off the wooden walls. She pointed a trembling finger at Jasper. "You want to tell them about the debt? Tell them! Tell them how you broke my arm because you lost at cards." "Clara, stop this hysteria," Jasper hissed, looking around at the gathering crowd. She pulled up the sleeve of her dress, shoving it past her elbow to reveal the jagged, badly set bone of her forearm and the lattice of faded scars. "Look at it," Clara demanded, turning to the townspeople. "He did this. And tell them about the baby. Jasper, tell them about Sarah." The name hung in the air like a gunshot. "He pushed me down the stairs because I would not give him the grocery money for his gambling debts," Clara cried, tears streaming down her face, but she did not wipe them away. "I lay on the floor bleeding, and he walked over me to get his coat. He killed my child, and now he wants to sell me to Barrett to pay for his next game." The crowd shifted. The whispers changed tone. They were Westerners. Hard people, but they had a code. A man who beat a woman was looked down upon. A man who killed a child was lower than a snake. "He is lying to you," Clara shouted. "He is not a grieving husband. He is a monster." Jasper's face turned a mottled red. "Sheriff, shut her up," he snapped. Eli stepped down, placing himself between Clara and the lawmen. He stood with his legs apart, his hand hovering near his Colt. "She speaks the truth," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. "And anyone who tries to put a hand on her will have to climb over my dead body to do it." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The sheriff looked at the crowd. He saw the blacksmith frowning. He saw the storekeeper shaking his head. The tide was turning. "We will settle this in the street," Miller muttered. "Not in an alley." He signaled his deputies. They backed away, but the threat remained. "We will come for you tonight. Clara," Jasper promised, his voice low and venomous. "And when I get you back, you will wish you had died on those stairs." They left, but the war had only just begun. The sky turned a sickly shade of green as afternoon wore on. Storm clouds, tall as mountains and black as ink, piled up on the horizon. The air grew thick and electric, making the hair on Clara's arms stand up. In the distance, thunder rolled like artillery fire. Clara did not go back inside. She wiped her face and looked at Eli. "We need help," she said. Eli nodded. "We cannot fight them alone. Miller has 4 deputies. Barrett has hired guns." Clara went to the women first. She found Mrs. Gable, the widow who ran the boarding house. Mrs. Gable had always been stiff with her, but she had listened to Clara's scream in the alley. "He cheated you too, didn't he?" Clara asked. Standing on the widow's porch. "Barrett, he bought your husband's land for pennies after he died. Mrs. Gable looked at Clara's scars. She looked at the fire in her eyes. "He did," the widow admitted quietly. "He told me it was the law. It was a lie." Clara said, "Stand with me, please." Eli, meanwhile, sought out the weak link in the sheriff's chain. He found Deputy Hayes sitting behind the livery stable, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. Hayes was young, barely 20, and he had looked sick when Jasper spoke of the back rooms. "You heard him," Eli said, emerging from the shadows. Hayes jumped, reaching for his gun, but stopped when he saw Eli's empty hands. "I heard him," Hayes whispered. "Is that the law you signed up for?" Eli asked. "Pimping out women to pay gambling debts?" Hayes looked down at his boots. "The sheriff says. He says it is legal paper. It is forged," Eli said, "and you know it, if you stand by while this happens. Son, you will never scrub the stain off your soul." Hayes took a shuddering breath. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "I found this in Miller's desk," Hayes said, his voice barely audible. "It is a telegram from St. Louis, from a forger named Silas, confirming the documents were sent." Eli took the paper. His rough fingers brushed the boy's hand. "You are a good man. Hayes, do not let them change that." By dusk, the wind was whipping dust into swirling columns that danced down the main street. Horses at the hitching rails laid their ears back and stomped, sensing the violence in the air. The town was shuttered, but eyes watched from every crack and keyhole. Clara and Eli walked to the center of the street. They did not hide. They stood in the open, in front of the sheriff's office. "Come out," Eli roared. The wind tore the words from his mouth, but they were heard. Sheriff Miller, Jasper, and Barrett emerged. They were flanked by 3 deputies and 2 of Barrett's hired ranch hands. 7 men against a woman and a drifter. "This ends now," Clara shouted. She held up the telegram Hayes had given Eli. "We know about the forgery. We know about the bribes." Jasper laughed. A thin, brittle sound. "You have a scrap of paper. I have the town." He drew a derringer from his vest pocket. "Sheriff, arrest them. If they resist, kill them." The sheriff drew his revolver. The deputies followed suit. Eli did not hesitate. He stepped in front of Clara, his body a shield. His hand hovered over his gun, his knuckles whitening, his eyes narrowed to slits. He saw the geometry of the fight. 7 targets, 2 seconds. The odds were impossible, but he wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to buy her time. "Put the guns down!" a voice shouted. From the boardwalk, the blacksmith stepped out with a shotgun. "Misses!" Gable stood on her porch with a rifle. Deputy Hayes stepped out of the sheriff's office, his gun drawn, pointed at Miller. "I cannot let you do this, Sheriff," Hayes said, his voice cracking. "Treason!" Miller shouted, turning his gun toward the boy. Chaos erupted. A shot rang out. Barrett, firing at the blacksmith. The street exploded into noise. Eli drew. His motion was a blur, the muscle memory of 1,000 hours of practice. He fired, not at the sheriff, but at the hired gun aiming at Hayes. The man dropped, clutching his shoulder. Jasper raised his derringer, aiming straight at Clara. Clara saw the silver flash of the barrel. She did not scream. She did not freeze. She lunged. She shoved a deputy who was taking aim at Eli, knocking his arm wide. The deputy's bullet tore up the dust at Eli's feet. Eli pivoted, firing again. He hit Barrett in the leg, sending the cattleman crashing to the dirt. But Jasper was still standing. He leveled the derringer at Eli's back. "Eli!" Clara screamed. She threw herself toward Jasper, grabbing for the gun. Jasper fired. The sound was a small pop compared to the roar of the Colts, but the impact was sickening. Eli jerked as if he had been punched. A blossom of red exploded on the left side of his shirt, just above the hip. He stumbled, falling to one knee, but he did not drop his gun. He looked up, eyes burning with a terrible light. He saw Jasper raising the gun for a second shot, this time at Clara's head. Eli steadied his hand with his other arm. He took a breath. He fired. The bullet caught Jasper square in the chest. The gambler looked surprised, his mouth opening in a silent "oh." He dropped the derringer and fell backward into the mud, his expensive suit ruining in the dust. "Stop! It is over!" Hayes shouted. The firing stopped. The silence that rushed back into the street was deafening. Smoke drifted in the heavy air. Barrett was moaning on the ground. Jasper lay still, eyes staring up at the storm clouds. Eli swayed. The gun slipped from his fingers. He collapsed forward into the dirt. "Eli!" Clara scrambled over to him, falling to her knees. She turned him over, her hands pressing frantically against the wound in his side. Blood was soaking his shirt, dark and hot. "No, no, no!" she sobbed, terror gripping her heart with icy fingers. "Look at me, Eli, look at me!" Eli's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his face gray. He tried to smile, but it was a grimace of pain. "Are you hurt?" he rasped. "I am fine," Clara wept, tearing the hem of her petticoat to make a compress. "You stupid man. You stupid, brave man. Stay with me." The townspeople gathered around them in a circle. The blacksmith kept his shotgun trained on Miller, who stood with his hands raised, realizing his power had evaporated with the smoke. Just then, the sound of hoofbeats thundered down the street. A rider on a massive bay horse pulled up, badge gleaming on his chest. It was the U.S. Marshal, followed by the circuit judge from Silver Creek in a buggy. "What in God's name is happening here?" the marshal demanded. "Looking at the bodies." Deputy Hayes stepped forward, holstering his gun. "Justice, Marshal, just a little late." The next hour was a blur of activity. The doctor was summoned for Eli. The marshal and the judge took statements. The evidence was overwhelming. The telegram, the testimony of Mrs. Gable, the confession of a terrified Sheriff Miller who turned on Barrett to save his own skin. Clara sat on the boardwalk outside the doctor's office, her dress stained with Eli's blood. She answered the questions mechanically. Yes, Jasper was her husband. Yes, he abused her. Yes, Eli acted in self-defense. By midnight, the verdict of the street was confirmed by the law. Jasper's claim was nullified by his death and the proof of his fraud. Sheriff Miller was in irons. Barrett was under house arrest, pending trial for corruption. Clara was free. She went into the doctor's office. Eli was lying on a cot, his torso bandaged. He was pale, but the doctor said the bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting anything vital. He would live. Clara sat beside him, taking his rough hand in hers. She pressed it to her cheek, closing her eyes, letting the relief wash over her. "We did it," she whispered. "You are safe. I am safe." Eli looked at her. His eyes were sad, filled with a pain that had nothing to do with his wound. "You are safe, Clara," he said softly. The door opened. The marshal stepped in. He took off his hat, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said to Clara, "could you give us a moment?" Clara looked from the marshal to Eli. She saw the look of resignation on Eli's face. "No," Clara said. "Whatever you have to say, you say it to me too." The marshal sighed. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I checked the wires," he said to Eli. Like the judge asked, "Elias Putz, there's a warrant out of Kansas, manslaughter, and flight to avoid prosecution. It was self-defense," Clara said fiercely. "Standing up. He told you that. The law in Kansas says different." "Ma'am," the marshal said gently, "and now that he has identified himself, I have a duty. I have to take him in." He looked at Eli. "You are in no shape to ride tonight, son, but come morning, I have to put you on the stage to Abilene. You will stand trial." Eli nodded. "I know. Marshal, I will come with you," Clara said immediately. "I will testify." "No," Eli said. Clara turned to him, shocked. "What? You cannot come?" "Clara, Kansas is not this town, the family of the boy I killed. They have money. They have power. It will be a circus. If you are there, they will use you to get to me. They will drag your name through the mud again." "I do not care," Clara cried. "I do," Eli said. He sat up, groaning with the effort. "I spent the last month fighting to get you free of a life that was killing you. I did not do it so you could follow a convict into a cage." The marshal looked at them, then put his hat back on. "I will be outside. You have got until dawn." He left the room. Clara stood by the cot, her hands shaking. "You are leaving me?" she whispered. Eli swung his legs over the edge of the cot. He stood up, swaying slightly, clutching his side. He walked over to her. "I have to go. Clara, if I stay, I am a fugitive. I will bring the law down on your head every day. You have a chance now. You have the laundry, you have your name back. You can build something real here." He reached out, his hand cupping her face. His thumb brushed away a tear. "I have to go and face it," he said. "I have to set things right, or I will never be the man you deserve." Clara grabbed his shirt, her fingers digging into the fabric. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and terrified, stripping her soul bare. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking into a sob. "Please do not leave me broken." The words hung in the air, a devastating echo of her deepest fear. She wasn't asking him to stay for her safety anymore. She was asking him to stay for her heart. Eli froze. He looked down at her, and his own heart shattered. He wanted to stay. God, he wanted to stay. He wanted to build that porch they had never talked about, but both imagined. He wanted to wake up and see her face every morning. But he knew that if he stayed, he would eventually destroy her. The warrant would always be there. The bounty hunters would come. He pulled her into him, wrapping his arms around her, holding her so tight it hurt his wound. But he didn't care. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in, the smell of rain and dust and courage. "I am not leaving you broken." "Clara," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with tears. "You are the strongest thing I have ever known. You fixed me." He pulled back, forcing her to look at him. "I am going to go to Kansas. I am going to stand in that box and tell the truth. And if I get out, if I ever get free, I will find you. I promise you. Clara, I will find you." He kissed her then. It was a kiss of desperation, of salt and blood and love that felt like dying. Then he stepped back. His hand slipped from hers. "Goodbye. Clara." He turned and walked toward the back door, moving stiffly, into the dark alley where the marshal was waiting. Clara stood in the center of the room. The silence rushed back in, louder than the gunshots had been. She felt the cold air from the open door. She ran to the door. She looked out. She saw Eli's silhouette at the end of the alley, limping slightly, walking away from the only home he had ever known. The vast, unforgiving landscape of the West stretched out beyond him. swallowing him into the night. "Eli!" she screamed, but the wind took the name and scattered it. He did not look back. He couldn't. Clara sank to her knees on the floorboards, clutching the locket at her throat. She was alone. The wind howled through the eaves. But as she knelt there, weeping, she realized something. Her hands were shaking. Yes, her heart was breaking. Yes, but she was not broken. She was standing in the wreckage of her life, and she was still breathing. She was free, and she had a promise. She watched the darkness until his shadow was gone, and then, slowly, she stood up. She closed the door against the wind and bolted it. She would wait, and while she waited, she would live. The seasons in the high country did not turn gently. They broke. The suffocating heat of the summer, the season of blood and dust that had defined Clara's struggle, eventually gave way to a sharp, biting autumn. The cottonwood trees along the river turned a brilliant, trembling gold before the wind stripped them bare, leaving gray skeletons scratching against a steel-colored sky. Then came the winter, a silent, white siege that buried Red Butte in 3 feet of snow, isolating the town from the rest of the world for weeks at a time. Clara watched it all from the window of what was now her own establishment, in the power vacuum left by the arrest of Barrett and the disgrace of the sheriff. The town had shifted. Properties had changed hands. Debts had been recalibrated, with the last of the money she had saved, and a loan from the blackened-thumbed blacksmith who had stood with her in the street. Clara had taken over the lease of Mrs. Gable's boarding house when the widow decided to move east to be with her sister. It was not a palace. It was a drafty, 2-story timber building that smelled permanently of wood smoke and bacon grease. But it was hers. She scrubbed the floors until the wood was pale and clean. She sewn new curtains of blue calico to replace the dingy gray rags that had hung there for years. She cooked stews thick with root vegetables and beef, feeding the drovers and miners who passed through with a kind of fierce, quiet dignity. She was no longer the cowering washerwoman who hugged the walls of the alley. She was Mrs. Thorne, though she used the name only for business legality, preferring just Clara to those she trusted, the proprietress of the cleanest house in the territory. Work was her anchor. She rose before dawn to light the stove, the air in the kitchen so cold her breath plumed before her face. She kneaded dough with knuckles that were no longer cracked and bleeding, though they were strong and broad now. She found a rhythm in the days, a steadiness that slowly began to mortar the cracks in her spirit. Yet, the silence of the house at night was loud. When the last boarder had retired and the fire was banked, Clara would sit in her rocking chair, the one she had bought for herself, and listen to the wind howling around the eaves. It was the same wind that had battered the line cabin in the mountains. It carried the same scent of pine and distance. She did not weep. She had cried enough tears to fill the dry riverbed. Instead, she waited. She did not know what she was waiting for. A letter, a ghost, or just the permission to stop holding her breath. The town of Red Butte had not become a paradise. Prejudice was a weed with deep roots, and it did not wither overnight just because a few bad men were in chains. There were still women who crossed the street to avoid walking near Clara's shadow. They whispered behind their fans at church, murmuring that a woman who had been part of a gunfight, a woman who had lived on the road with a fugitive, was no proper lady. They called her hard. They said she had forgotten her place. Clara let them talk. She found that their words, which once felt like stones thrown at her glass heart, now felt like dry leaves blowing past her boots. She had earned her place. One afternoon, a young girl named Sarah, a name that still made Clara's heart ache, came running to the back door of the boarding house. Sarah worked at the saloon, wiping tables, and she was shaking, her dress torn at the shoulder. "He says I owe him," Sarah sobbed, clutching Clara's apron. "The new foreman. He says I have to come upstairs." Clara did not hesitate. She wiped the flour from her hands and walked straight to the saloon. She did not take a gun. She took her presence. She walked through the swinging doors, the afternoon light cutting a swath through the smoke. The saloon fell quiet. Clara Thorne walked with her head high, her shoulders back. her eyes sweeping the room with a gaze that challenged any man to cross her. She found the foreman, a burly man new to the territory, trying to drag the girl back by her arm. "Let her go," Clara said. The foreman laughed. "And who are you, the mother hen? I am the woman who put the last man who tried to own people in this town in the ground," Clara said. Her voice was level, devoid of fear. "And I am telling you that girl does not work for you anymore. She works for me." The foreman looked at her. He looked at the men around the room, men who had seen Eli fire that shot, men who knew the story. None of them moved to back him up. The bartender busied himself polishing a glass. The foreman let the girl go. Clara took Sarah's hand and walked her out of the saloon, down the center of the main street. She did not hunch her shoulders. She met the eyes of the storekeeper's wife, who was watching from the window. She did not look away until the other woman did. The landscape, once a source of terror, became her cathedral. On Sunday afternoons, when the house was quiet, Clara would saddle the small mare she had bought, a sturdy, stubborn creature she called Bess, and ride out of town. She rode past the edge of the valley, up toward the red rock buttes that stood like sentinels against the sky. She learned to read the land. She learned that the circling of hawks meant water or a kill. She learned that the purple clouds in the west meant she had an hour to find shelter. She would stop at the top of a rise and look out over the endless brown plains. The land was indifferent to her. It did not care about her past, her shame, or her loss. And in that indifference, she found peace. The vastness did not want to swallow her anymore. It gave her room to breathe. She was a speck on the face of the earth, but she was a living speck, enduring just like the sagebrush and the twisted juniper. But she never rode toward the north. She never rode toward the trail that led to Kansas. That was a wound she could not yet touch. Spring arrived with a violent thaw. The river swelled, brown and roaring, tearing away the dead wood of winter. The mud in the streets turned to soup, and the air smelled of wet earth and new grass. It was on a Tuesday in April that the news came. Clara was sweeping the front porch, pushing the red dust back into the street. A rider trotted up, splashing through the puddles. He wore a badge on his vest, a deputy U.S. Marshal. "Mrs. Thorne?" the man asked, tipping his hat. Clara gripped the broom handle. Her heart gave a single, painful thud against her ribs. "I am she. I was asked to pass on a word," the deputy said, leaning on his saddle horn. "I just came down from Abilene." Clara stopped breathing. The world narrowed down to the man's dusty face. There was a trial, the deputy said, for Elias Putz, the man they call the Gunfighter. "Yes," Clara whispered. It was a circus. All right. The Weaver family hired fancy lawyers, tried to paint him as a cold-blooded murderer. But the witnesses, they came out of the woodwork. Folks who saw the fight years ago, a barman, an old lady who watched from a balcony. They testified that Weaver drew first. They said Putz tried to walk away 3 times. The deputy paused, shifting his chewing tobacco to the other cheek. The jury was out for 2 hours. They came back with a verdict. Not guilty. Self-defense. Clara felt the porch tilt under her feet. She reached out and grabbed the railing to steady herself. "He is free?" she asked, her voice cracking. "He is free." The deputy nodded. "Walked out of the courthouse a week ago?" "Where? Where is he?" The deputy shrugged. "Hard to say. A man like that, who has been running for so long. He might go anywhere, but he looked tired. Ma'am, bone tired. I reckon he is looking for a place to rest." The deputy tipped his hat again and rode on toward the sheriff's office. Clara stood on the porch. The broom fell from her hand, clattering onto the wood. She pressed her hands to her mouth, a sob breaking free, not of grief, but of a hope so sharp it felt like pain. He was alive. He was free, but he was not here. The weeks that followed were an agony of anticipation. Every time a dog barked, Clara looked at the door. Every time a horse rode past, she rushed to the window. But the road remained empty of the one figure she yearned to see. Doubt began to creep in, cold and insidious. Had he changed his mind? Had the freedom tasted so sweet that he wanted to keep running? To lose himself in the new territories where no one knew his name? Maybe he thought she was better off without him. Maybe the promise he made in the doctor's office was just words spoken to comfort a weeping woman. No, Clara told herself, kneading the dough with fierce punches. He promised. He does not break promises. It was late May when he came. The afternoon was hot, the air shimmering with heat waves that rose from the hard-packed earth. Clara was in the vegetable garden she had planted behind the house, pulling weeds from the rows of beans. The sun beat down on her neck, warm and heavy. She heard the sound of a horse walking slowly. It was not the trot of a traveler passing through, but the plodding walk of a beast at the end of a long journey. Clara stood up. She wiped her dirty hands on her apron. She walked around the side of the house to the front street. A rider was coming down the center of the road. He was backlit by the western sun, a dark silhouette cut out of the glare. Dust swirled around the horse's hooves. Clara squinted, shading her eyes with her hand. The rider sat with a distinctive slump, a weariness that went down to the bone, but there was a solidity to him. He did not move with the rocking of the horse. He was part of it. Clara's heart slammed against her chest. She took a step forward, off the porch, into the dust. The horse stopped 10 feet away. It was the same big dust-colored gelding, looking older and rib-thin, but steady. The man swung down from the saddle. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side where the bullet had gone through. He took off his hat and slapped the dust from it against his leg. He looked older. The gray in his beard had spread, and there were new lines etched around his eyes, deep grooves of exhaustion and worry. He was thinner, his coat hanging loosely on his frame, but his eyes, the dark, haunted look was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady light. Eli. Clara breathed. He looked at her. He took in the clean apron, the strength in her stance, the way she looked at him without flinching. "Clara," he said. His voice was raspier than she remembered, worn down by the wind. They stood there for a long moment, separated by 10 feet of road and 6 months of silence. The town around them seemed to fade away. There was no sheriff, no gossip, no staring eyes, just a man and a woman and the dust. "You came back," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I said I would," Eli replied. He dropped his hat in the dirt. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if waiting for permission. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said. "I had to wait for the papers. I wanted to bring you the paper that said I was a free man. I did not want to come back until I could stay." "You could have written," Clara said, a tear slipping down her cheek. I thought you might have kept riding." Eli shook his head slowly. "There is nowhere else to ride to. Clara, my map ends here." He looked down at his hands, those large, scarred hands that hung empty at his sides. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Not of the hanging. I was afraid that when I came back, you would have realized you were better off without a worn-out gunman in your life. I was afraid I would see that look in your eyes, the one that expects to be hurt." Clara looked at him. She saw the uncertainty in him, the vulnerability that terrified him more than any bullet. She took a step toward him, then another. She closed the distance until she was standing right in front of him. "Look at my eyes, Eli," she whispered. He looked down into her face. He searched her gaze. He saw the scars of her past. Yes, but he didn't see fear. He saw a fierce, burning welcome. "I am not afraid," Clara said. "Not of you. Never of you." Eli let out a breath that sounded like a sob trapped in his chest. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, giving her every chance to back away. "Can I touch you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded. "Please." He reached out. His rough hands, hands that had mended fences, broken horses, and taken lives, cupped her face. They were shaking slightly. He held her as if she were made of holy water, as if she were the only clean thing in a dirty world. Clara closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. She raised her own hands and covered his, pressing them harder against her skin. She felt the calluses, the warmth, the pulse in his wrists. "Eli," She sighed. He pulled her in. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held her tight, the way a drowning man holds driftwood. And Clara held him back, her arms locking around his waist, her fingers digging into the back of his worn coat. She felt him shaking. She felt the wetness of his tears against her skin. "I missed you," he choked out. "God, I missed you. I am here," Clara soothed, stroking the hair at the nape of his neck. "I am right here. You are home." He pulled back just enough to look at her. He traced the line of her lip with his thumb. Then he kissed her. It was not the hesitant kiss of the cabin. It was a claiming. It was a surrender. It was a kiss that tasted of the miles he had ridden and the nights she had waited. It was deep and slow and full of a desperate, aching tenderness. Under the vast, indifferent sky of the American West, they clung to each other. Two broken things that had fused into something whole. They walked the horse back to the stable together, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on his waist. They did not care who saw. That evening, they sat on the back porch of the boarding house, watching the sun go down in a blaze of orange and violet. The air was cooling, the crickets beginning their nightly chorus. They talked about the future. It was not a conversation of grand dreams, but of practical realities. "I have some money left from the trial," Eli said, rolling a cigarette with practiced movements. "Not much, but enough for a down payment on a parcel of land." "Where?" Clara asked. "There is a spot north of town," Eli said, "near the creek. The grass is good. It has a cabin, needs work. The roof is gone, but the walls are solid. We could run a few head of cattle, maybe some horses. It will be hard work." Clara said, "The winters out there are brutal." "I know," Eli said. He looked at her sideways. "And folks here, they might never truly accept us. I will always be the gunman. You will always be the woman who ran away." Clara looked out at the darkening buttes. She thought about the whispers. She thought about the wind. "Let them talk," she said. "We do not need them. We need the land, we need the work, and we need each other." She turned to him. "We can take in strays, Eli, animals that nobody wants, maybe people who have nowhere else to go. A place for broken things to mend." Eli looked at her, and the love in his eyes was so intense it made her chest ache. "A place for us," he said. A year later, the cabin stood on a rise overlooking the creek. The roof was new, tight shingles that kept out the rain. A corral had been built of cedar posts, holding 2 horses and a milk cow. Smoke curled from the chimney, smelling of coffee and pine. It was a hard life. The drought had come back in July, turning the grass brown and forcing them to haul water from the river until their backs screamed. The winter had been vicious, snow drifting up to the windowsills, but they had survived. Clara stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The wind was blowing, tugging at the loose strands of her hair, but she did not flinch from it. She liked the wind now. It felt like freedom. She looked down toward the corral. Eli was there. He was repairing a section of the fence where a bull had broken through. He wore a faded blue shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Clara watched him work. She watched the way his muscles moved under the skin, the economy of his motion. He lifted a heavy rail as if it weighed nothing, slotting it into place. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with his forearm. He looked up and saw her watching him. He dropped his hammer and walked up the slope toward the house. His gait was still stiff. The cold weather made the old bullet wound ache, but he moved with a purpose. He climbed the steps to the porch. He smelled of sweat and horse and leather. He stood in front of her, blocking out the sun. "Everything all right?" he asked. Clara smiled. She reached out and took his hands. They were dirt-stained, scarred, the knuckles swollen from the work. They were the roughest things she knew. She turned them over, tracing the lines of his palms. "I was just watching you," she said. Eli's face softened. He pulled his hands gently from hers and reached up to cup her face. His skin was like sandpaper against her cheek, but his touch was light as a feather. "I am not going anywhere." "Clara," he said, reading the shadow of the old fear that sometimes still flickered in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. She leaned her forehead against his. She closed her eyes and listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. She thought about the girl she had been, the girl who flinched at a footstep, the girl who prayed to be invisible. That girl was gone, buried under the red dust of the past. In her place was a woman standing on her own porch, held by a man who had walked through fire to get back to her. "Please do not leave me broken," she had begged him once, in the dark of her despair. Eli's thumbs brushed her temples. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "You were never broken," he murmured against her mouth. "You were just waiting to be found." Clara opened her eyes. She looked at him, and she looked at the wild, harsh land that stretched out around them. It was dangerous. It was unforgiving. It would try to kill them with ice and thirst and storm. But as she rested in the cradle of his rough hands, her heart beating a steady rhythm against his, Clara knew the truth. They had built a fortress out of their scars, and in this vast, wide-open country, they were finally, truly home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a long journey from the dusty streets of Red Butte to the quiet peace of that final porch. And I hope Clara and Eli's story resonated with you. I would love to hear where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know which part of the story meant the most to you. If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Feel free to share your thoughts and feelings about the ending in English in the comments section. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.